My name is Wei Zhan, and I'm a professor of food science at IIT. And I was given the pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Ram, as our today's speaker, if that's okay. Okay, so let me do a quick intro. So, Dr. Ram, great pleasure to have you here, offering us a research seminar. Um, Dr. Ran complete PhD degree and postdoctoral training in cereal science, both at North Dakota State University. Prior to that, he also holds degrees and certifications in food science and nutrition, including master degree from University Leeds and biotechnology and microbiology for his bachelor's degree from India, and also certificate in graduate certificate from North Dakota State University. Currently, Dr. Ram is a R&D manager at Bay State Milling Company in Massachusetts. His interest is using study grain and the products, how they correlate to human health using cereal chemistry and processing technologies. Okay, so I hope that's a quick intro for the program. I leave the seminar to you. Please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Zhang. I really appreciate the introduction. And thank you all for, being here. I really appreciate your presence. And also, thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and, some of the work that I'm currently doing. Now, as Dr. Zhang mentioned, I'm a cereal scientist by training. I've also had the chance to work with food science and nutrition in the past, as I trust some of you also are doing at the moment. So I've tried a few different things, and when I landed in the US, I ended up going to North Dakota State, great university. It's completely grain country, the Midwest, specifically Minnesota, North Dakota. I've heard people call it the grain basket of the US, if not the world. So a lot of my fundamental interest in grain science sort of started from there. A lot of my focus sort of really came out of going to North Dakota State. And as an extension of that, some of that work that I pursued as a PhD, graduate, and also as a postdoc, it sort of continued with me, followed me in my current role as well. So at the very outset, here's what I'd like to accomplish to give you an outline. I want to set the stage by giving you an overview about, grains in our diet and why we should care about grains. I'd like to make the case for grains. Also, talk about some of the key public health challenges that are linked to, nutritional imbalances in our diet, and how grains could potentially address some of these challenges, and also some examples of how they have been helpful in sort of dealing with some of these diet-linked challenges. So with that, I hope that's a good stage to go from. So grains, I guess fundamentally, when I say cereals or grains, to my family members or friends, when I say, "Hey, I study cereals," the first response that I get is, "Why are you so interested in breakfast cereals? Or what's the big deal? Like cereal is corn, or they're at best familiar with bread, or if you're from India, like I see many of you on the call are, they think about rotis and flatbreads and stuff like that. They don't really make the association between grains and the variety of other foods that we consume as staples. And that was one of that really got me curious when I first got into grain science. And as I spent more time in this field, I realized that it's a fairly common thing for most consumers. If we think about ourselves as consumers, we sometimes don't really appreciate grains for what they do, for the role they play in our diets. Like I said, they're staple components of our diet. They're big sources of, or probably the primary sources of carbohydrates, proteins, and micronutrients. In addition to legumes, you have cereal grains and you also have pseudo cereals, which we will talk about a little further down the road. Grains are pretty cool because they're ubiquitous. Pretty much every food culture, uh, has grains as a part of it. You can take Africa, you can take Asia, you can take the US. Grains are consumed in some shape, way, or form, across the board. And that's the second, interesting thing. They're also very unique in that they have stayed with the human society for so long. I mean, as far as we can trace our history, back in the past, we go thousands of years back and you'd still find grains. I believe grains like barley and einkorn were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, what was known as Mesopotamia and modern day Iraq, Iran. By some accounts, 10 to 12,000 years ago. So that really has shaped, they've stayed with us for a long time, and they continue to sort of shape, how we eat, and we're still interested in how we can sort of develop foods out of grains. So all these reasons make me think that, grains are sort of underrated heroes on our plates, which is why I, sometimes like to champion the cause of grain science and like, hey, we really need to be looking at grains in a different way. So I know a lot of you are food scientists in the making. Potentially, some of you already have experience dealing with grains or formulating foods, product development with grains. But like I said, it's a very common misconception that people have between grains and cereals. What is a lentil versus what is a legume? So I thought I'll just sort of give a brief introduction, or just walk through the diversity of grains that we have. And I'm speaking just about the US, just speaking about the US. I'm not even talking about the world, simply because, when we start talking global, then there's a lot to talk about. So keeping the US as my frame of reference, the United States. So these are some of the major grains that we have. And number one, grains are edible dry seeds of certain food crops. So grains are a catch-all phrase, and it can include cereals. So cereals are specifically dry edible seeds of grasses. So they belong to family Poaceae. So that goes from corn to oats, from wheat to rice, and also some of the other less commonly consumed, but people are getting more aware of things like sorghum, millets. In fact, barley. I used to work a lot on barley in my graduate student days. Again, a lot of people were very surprised when I told them you could actually eat barley. I mean, I know it's used for brewing for the most part in the US, but there are varieties of barley, hull-less barleys or naked barley, where the hulls just fall off quite easily. It's easy to thresh off. And you can actually eat them just like you would eat rice. So it gives you a nice chewy texture. I personally love the texture, and it was an extension of my research was like getting to try different kinds of barley, and they come in such different colors. I've tried black barley, purple barley, colorless barley, all because they have different levels of anthocyanins and pigmentation in their hull or aleurone layer. So again, diversity is the name of the game. There's just so many directions you can go with grains. And this diversity is important because this gives us like innumerable options when we talk about product development. When you start thinking about, okay, what can you make out of this? How can you process them? You have a great starting point to begin with. So we've spoken about grasses. What about legumes? Um, so, and what about pseudo cereals? So to make the distinction between these two, pulses are again a catch-all phrase for these are the dry edible seeds of plants that belong to family Fabaceae. So legumes would also include crops like soybean or peanut because they have nitrogen fixing bacteria in their root nodules. So that's a common trait in all of these plants. But we don't really consume soybean as a dry seed most of the times. Um, so that's why we make the distinction here of pulses versus the rest of the legumes. Likewise, pseudo cereals are not the same as cereals because they tend to be dicots versus cereals are monocots. And pseudo cereals can belong to a wide range of families. So they don't all belong to the same family. Again, depending on which part of the world you're from, I'm very sure you've probably consumed pulses in some form, pseudo cereals in some form. I come from the south of India, so we consume a pseudo cereal called ragi or finger millet very commonly. It's really a staple food. It's wrongly called a poor man's food because the world has woken up to all these great nutritional benefits: high calcium, high fiber, low GI, better glycemic control. So the point I'm trying to make is, number one, there is this immense diversity, and some of these crops have been with us for a long time. And it's not that we've forgotten about it, we just haven't commercialized it to the extent that we have some other crops. And that's where the idea of ancient grains comes in. So to illustrate that point, chickpeas I've highlighted in black and italics. Same with lentils and dry peas versus the pseudo cereals, which isn't highlighted as such. That's because the chickpeas, lentils, dry peas that we know today have been bred selectively and modified to a point where they don't resemble their native ancestors. That's why they're not called ancient grains versus things like amaranth or even barley, rye for that matter. They continue to be consumed and they exist in pretty much a very similar form, like how people consume them like hundreds of years ago. There isn't too much of a difference. But wheat, corn, these crops have been modified quite a lot. In fact, the wheat, common bread wheat, is a hexaploid. It's called an allohexaploid, and if you want to get technical on a breeding scale, because it's a combination of chromosomes from different species of wheat. So if you were to go back 1,000 years, you probably wouldn't find this, in the wild. So that's why some grains are referred to as ancient grains. Examples: millets, barley. Some are not ancient grains. So again, this comes up when you talk about consumer trends. When consumers tell you they're interested in ancient grains, but they're surprised to know that, oh, we've consumed wheat, but it's not the same that my ancestors consumed. So I think it's a very important distinction to make. It also plays an important role in product development because when you start making claims, you need to know these differences and communicate them. What about some lesser known cereals? Okay, here's a fun fact if you haven't heard of these guys before. So freekeh and bulgur are not even different kinds of wheat. They're just they're wheat prepared in different ways. So one bulgur is parboiled and then dried. So we have an equivalent of this in India again. We call it broken wheat. It's very similar to that, but it goes one step further. Here we have a parboiling step. So that changes the cooking properties a little bit. Freekeh is dry roasted. And then broken down. So it has slightly different cooking properties. Fonio is a type of millet that's consumed in Africa. And the ones on the bottom, so einkorn, emmer, Khorasan wheat, spelt, these are all different kinds of wheat. they all differ in their ploidy. So the number of sets of chromosomes that they have, they all differ in that sense. And they also differ in like the regions where they were grown and traditionally consumed. So again, wheat in different places is consumed, prepared, grown in different ways. So technically, these four guys would be classified as ancient grains, whereas your regular conventional bread wheat cannot be called ancient grains. So again, it's a lot of it is terminology and semantics, but I think it's important as food scientists even to just know these distinctions. All right. Another reason why we need to care about grains and keeping in mind that we want to talk about nutrition, right? So why am I going on about diversity and now grain consumption? So grains, and specifically wheat, oats, and corn, they represent the predominantly consumed grains in the US, at least. Now, this spread might change if you look at Asia. It's probably going to be heavier in rice versus wheat. I know in parts of India, if you go to the south, you have a rice-heavy diet, a little bit of wheat. But if you go to the northwest, like places like Punjab, if you're familiar with it, it's a wheat-heavy diet, less of rice. So again, where you come from really determines, or the food culture you come from determines some of these cues. But for now, in the context of the US, wheat is still the foundation of the diet. That's where we get most of our calories from. Oats has seen an uptick in recent times, especially post-COVID. I think it just took off, and that's what we're seeing even when we deal with customers and within our own business. That's a very consistent trend. Corn is interesting because the funny thing is corn is the most grown crop in the US. So it follows as corn, soy, and wheat in terms of acreage. The funny part is most of the corn that we grow in the US doesn't even go towards food. It has industrial applications like bioethanol. It has feed applications. So that's why, though corn is produced to a much significantly higher extent, wheat still forms the basis of the diet. So again, that's a really interesting quirk. Some reasons for this is that wheat, um, because of gluten, actually has very unique processing and physicochemical properties. Gluten, again, that's a story for a different day. But long story short, gluten is pretty much magic dust. It does certain things that no other protein is able to do, which also is one of the reasons why wheat can be processed into so many different products. You can bake it into a bread, you can bake a cake out of it, you can make a tortilla. You have different kinds of wheat that have different levels of proteins for these different applications. So it's a very versatile crop, to work with. So the reason it's important to understand this is when we talk about making changes to our diet, if we want to improve our health, and that's our intention, then grains really provide an opportunity. They provide an inlet to make these changes. You could argue, well, I'm going to eat more fruits and vegetables. Great, go for it. But if you think about where most of your calories are coming from, fruits and vegetables play a very important part, but your calories are not really coming from there. So that's why it's important to have grains, especially cereals and pulses or legumes in your diet. So that's how you achieve a more balanced nutritional profile at the end of the day. So wheat and oats specifically, they provide a very unique opportunity to sort of make some of these changes to our diet, create products that can potentially improve our health as well. So with this sort of economic data or consumption data uh, at the back of our mind, I want to touch upon some of the top public health challenges that we have in the US. Out of these, we have heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, which classify as non-communicable chronic diseases, or NCDs for short. Now, this is interesting because As technology has improved over the last, 70 odd years since the Second World War, healthcare has improved. Access to healthcare has improved. We have better surgical techniques or better antibiotics. So basically, public health has focused a lot towards sort of cutting the incidence of infectious diseases. But at the same time, our dietary habits changed, right? Convenience foods sort of became more popular. TV dinners became more popular post, the Second World War. The emphasis became the emphasis shifted to convenience when we realized we can produce more, greater volumes of crops. So we went from a famine or a shortage situation to having, an abundance of these crops. So things started getting more refined. And that directly correlates with the rise in NCDs. And today we find ourselves in a tricky position with NCDs because, unlike infectious diseases, which might have a higher mortality rate in certain cases, NCDs don't. So you get this concept of prevalence. So incidence is, new cases of a disease or disorder, and prevalence is you have people affected by these diseases for, who live for long periods of time, because you're not going to, you know, how do I put this? It's not going to end your life, but you live with this compromised quality of life for a longer time. And that places a burden on the individual. It places a burden on the public health system. It places a burden on society on the whole. So you have numbers of people with diabetes, chronic heart disease, cardiovascular diseases on the rise. And that's why, diet being one of the, risk factors or, modifiable behaviors. That's why it's important to focus on diet, among other things like exercise and abstaining from tobacco, alcohol, so on and so forth. This is with a caveat, of course. The epidemiological transition kind of went on trend, on point until we got hit with COVID, and that flipped the switch all of a sudden. And COVID sort of complicated the dietary patterns as well, because as you know, we couldn't, there was a shortage of a lot of different kinds of foods, so people had to revert back to staple foods. A lot of people wouldn't have been able to go out and eat. More folks were interested in improving their health through diet. So COVID is a whole different story, but suffice to say that it did change the way people in the US consumed food. With that being said, the three conditions that I've highlighted represent like the top conditions which have a link to diet, right? And like I said, with nutrition, we always have to take a holistic approach. It's not a one size fits all kind of deal. It is a multifactorial situation. You have so many different risk factors and variables playing into this scenario. But in addition to improving physical activity, in addition to maintaining weight, I think diet, realistically speaking, provides a good opportunity to modify behaviors and really make these switches to more healthier options in an effort to sort of cut down the risk or even manage these diseases. And when we say diet, we can't not talk about the brain gut axis. Now, we spoke about public health. These diseases like CVD, diabetes, pretty well established. But what is emerging from more recent literature is that the diet, and in extension, like how the diet affects the gut, plays a bigger role in a bunch of other chronic conditions. So things like behavioral conditions, things like normal development of your nervous system, things like anxiety, right? There's a lot of research coming out connecting how the gut functions and the health of the gut to anxiety and people's stress levels. So in the future, it wouldn't be surprising to see some of these conditions being added to the list of public health challenges. And if I'm not mistaken, I think stress and anxiety are being recognized as, as being a public health concern in many parts of the country and even the world. So that's why, keeping the future in mind, diet and opting for healthy dietary options influences the state of our gut, and therefore we are able to potentially manage a lot of these other conditions too. So if we've spoken about the diet, and then if we've spoken about the gut, we can't get away from fiber, right? So when we talk about malnourishment in general, we have undernourishment, which is, conditions where you have deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, or even macronutrient deficiencies, folks not being able to, meet their calorie intake. But in the US context, it's the opposite that's the problem. It's overnourishment. It's the consumption of more than mandated level of calories that's the challenge. And it's not just the higher intake of calories, it's also what the diet is missing. And fiber is a huge gap because only 5% of the US population meets the recommended dietary target in when they consume their food. And that's really a minuscule amount of the population. And there's 300 odd million folks in the country. So I mean, if you do the math, it's a really small subset. And there is a disparity between how much fiber is consumed by men and women if you break it down on a statistical basis. But the common story is across the board, consumers do have a deficit of fiber in their diet on a daily basis. And that is important because if we know that not having fiber in the diet can create trouble, we also know that correcting for that, and it's a fairly easy correction to make, it provides us a lot of benefits, right? So if we were to just make this switch, if we were to just address fiber, for example, in our diet, consume sufficient levels of fiber, we could potentially have benefits relating to our blood glucose levels. And that's important because a lot of folks are not just, I mean, it's not the diabetic population that's the only challenge. We have a lot of folks who are pre-diabetic, and a larger proportion of people are pre-diabetic compared to folks that have, type 2 diabetes. So it's important to manage or regulate your, blood glucose levels or your glycemic, control. It has benefits for your heart health, your digestive health, and weight management, knowing that obesity and being overweight are known risk factors to a lot of other, chronic diseases. So why does all this matter again? It all comes down to that same question. Why should we bother about any of this? We spoke about grains having, there's a diversity of grains, but grains also are a great source of fiber. They represent a component of our diet, which we not only consume in, significant amounts. If we were to make certain switches, if we, for example, were to consume more whole grains as part of our diets, we could meet the fiber, requirement. Not only that, we also would be consuming good quality macronutrients, get our calories, no doubt, get quality proteins, and also your micronutrients and beneficial phytochemicals. So all this to say, grains, they are the perfect package because they tick a lot of boxes and they're good. We should be eating more, whole grains and more healthier options when it comes to grains. So with all of that as a background, let me make a slight pivot and talk about how grains, or give examples of how grains have helped, address some of these challenges in a nutritional sense, and what are some ongoing examples of, these efforts. So when we talk about innovation, very broadly speaking, in the context of grains, so we need to think about grain diversity, how we process these grains, and how we apply these grains, or what kinds of products we make from them. Grain diversity is important because the more ingredient options you have at your disposal, the more products you could potentially come up with. And what I mean by that is, if you were to make a gluten-free formulation, you could perhaps opt for millets, right? You have options there. Grain-based that give you, the options of fiber, they provide phytochemicals, calories, so on and so forth. So having diversity is important because it gives you choices. The application itself is important because, as product development scientists, for some of you, for example, you need to be able to understand what the consumer is looking for and sort of figure out applications and products that are most beneficial to them. So discovering or exploring these avenues gives you more options to apply these grains or utilize these grains in. And processing technologies basically bridges the gap between these other two components. It helps you get from your raw material to your end product or your end application. So in a nutshell, this is what innovation is all about. And in the context of developing grain-based foods to improve nutrition, these are the three elements that I'd like to focus on. So number one is improving the diversity of grain crops at our disposal. Traditionally, most grain crops have been developed either to give you a higher yield or to protect to impart disease resistance or tolerate pests or some sort of abiotic stress. A lot of times you go in with these goals and you're not really thinking about nutrition. Or rather, you assume that the nutrition isn't affected. But we know that that's not the case. You only have within a chromosome, within a defined or a limited number of genes, there's only so many levers or so many permutations and combinations you can sort of change. So if you improve yield, something else is definitely going to get affected. It could be a protein quality, it could be a protein content, or I'm just sort of speculating your fiber content, perhaps. I don't know. It could lead to unintended consequences. And that's why when we develop unique varieties, we've started to realize that we have to start putting nutrition front and center and not as a side goal or a byproduct of the other breeding targets. And again, there could be GMO or non-GMO approaches. And I'd like to highlight, examples on both sides of the fence. Now, the very first one is high amylose wheat, and this is something that one of the things that I'm more familiar with. We do work with high amylose wheat in my organization. So it is a conventionally bred strain of wheat or variety of wheat, and the difference here is with common wheat. When you talk about the starch content, right, you have a higher proportion of amylopectin and a lower proportion of amylose. In high amylose wheat, you just flip the switch, right? You have a higher proportion of amylose. And this is important, or this is useful, because we know high amylose behaves like resistant starch, which is a form of dietary fiber, right? And because it is able to perform as a fiber, function as a fiber, it has implications for your gut health. And because it resists digestion in your gastrointestinal tract, it also slows down the rate of, starch being converted to glucose. So there is glycemic control. So you are checking some of these very important, physiological boxes by consuming something like this. And if we were to look at the starch granule under the microscope, basically having a higher proportion of amylose makes the starch granule very tightly sort of packed. And when it's really tightly packed, it's able to resist the activity of enzymes. And that's what makes it resistance, in a very simple way. So the benefits here are, number one, it's non-GMO, which is an important consideration for a vast majority of consumers today. And Number two, the fiber, the location of the fiber. So in whole wheat, the fiber's on the exterior, right? Sure, you could eat a whole wheat loaf of bread. It delivers fiber. But the challenge is sometimes whole wheat has sensory issues. So for folks who are very particular about taste, if they're used to eating loaves of white bread, if they were to switch to whole wheat bread, a lot of times they don't like how it tastes. Or having higher amounts of bran could also increase the ash content. So that has implications for whether the loaf will rise properly or not, or even the appearance. So the sensory profile and the processing parameters are affected. But the location of this resistant starch is in the endosperm. So even if you were to mill or remove the outer layers of the grain, you're still left with most of the starch, resistant starch intact. So you could still bake a loaf of white bread, for example, with a higher fiber level without compromising taste or a lot of the functionality. And that's important because if you know product development and if you know consumers, you want to be very mindful that you are catering to what the consumer wants. And no matter how good a product is, if it can bring you back from the jaws of death, if it doesn't taste good, trust me, it's not going to sell. And that's the reality. That's a very important lesson when it comes to formulation and product development. It should do good. It should help the consumer. It should provide benefits, but it also has to pass certain sensory barriers. So that's why having high amylose wheat or resistant starch packaged in this form is relevant. And like I mentioned, we work with this line of wheat. There's intellectual property associated with it, but it's available, like it's on the market. It has been commercialized, and it's called Health Sense. But the more fun part is actually the picture of the bread slice in the lower right corner. So this is a loaf of Health Sense or high amylose wheat bread. So this looks exact. If I didn't tell you what this was, you probably wouldn't have made the difference out. And that's precisely the point. These are the sensory barriers or the check marks that we need to make when we develop products that are not only nutritious, but also taste good and perform the way you expect it to. In a similar way, another example of how we can have unique varieties for higher, better nutritional profiles is high protein, hull-less or naked oats. So again, these are non-GMO. We also deal with these varieties at my organization. So they're selectively bred to have a higher protein content, not just high, but better functionality as well. In this case specifically, the So Naked line of oats, it has about 30% higher protein content than conventional oats. So conventional oats, they are pretty high in protein across the board compared to other cereals. And here we go a few notches higher and deliver a higher protein content. And if you look at it in terms of dietary value, a cup of oats, right? Like oats as porridge, if it's a 28-gram portion of, oats, it delivers 10% of your daily, value for protein, which is quite significant. And that's just one portion, one meal. And it also has a pretty good PDCAS score. And PDCAS is one of the ways where we can sort of assess how good a protein is nutritionally. There are other ways to quantify this as well. You have DIAS, PDCAS. So there are some older ways as well. But this is 0.5 was a conservative PDCAS score for oats. And usually you'd compare it against, animal protein. Usually animal proteins have a score of 1, which is the highest, closer to that score. But with plant-based proteins, you always are going to expect a lower score than 1. And that's a fairly common trend. And I'll also touch upon that as when we speak about formulation and product development. On the other hand, we could have some we could have some GMO type crops too. And when you talk about biofortified crops, the connotation is that it's usually focused on improving the micronutrient profile, things like iron, zinc, selenium, so on and so forth. In the case of golden rice, which is fairly common, it's been in the news, or at least it was in the news when it was being developed. Again, because it's GM, there are certain other considerations to keep in mind in terms of acceptability. But the idea was to breed a grain that is rich in provitamin A carotenoids. So when you consume it, it gets converted into vitamin A, thereby reducing incidence of blindness. So I included this example to sort of compare and contrast the different ways we can achieve these, better nutrition in the grains. So what about the second, like processing technologies, right? We need to process grains because in their raw form, they're not going to do any good. They need to be processed because you need to really make a lot of the macronutrients digestible and more available to your digestive system. And also, you need to remove certain anti-nutritional factors. So it could be protein-based anti-nutritional factors. You could have things like phytic acid, which sort of reduces the efficiency with which minerals are absorbed. And with that, the first example is fermentation. It is a bioprocessing technique, and I've worked with fermentation a fair bit in the past, and I find it interesting because we've traditionally had fermentation all along, but it's also being used in so many different ways in the contemporary day and age as well. I'm sure you're familiar with lactic acid bacteria in a lot of probiotic formulations, but you're not just limited to that. You have filamentous fungi, which can be used for solid state fermentation. You have yeast, which you can pair with lactic acid bacteria in sourdough applications, for example. You could potentially develop grain-based yogurts, completely remove the dairy component out of it and still ferment grain-based substrates with these bacteria. So you could get into so many different kinds of applications of products like probiotics, prebiotics, and if you combine them, you can even get symbiotics that deliver sort of even more value to your gut or digestive health. Another example is sprouting. Again, very straightforward, very simple. It's been around for ages, but it's interesting because when you start quantifying or trying to understand the kind of physiological changes that happen during sprouting, you will realize that it's doing a whole lot more to the nutritional profile. It's making things like proteins more digestible because it's breaking it down into amino acids. It's breaking the starch into more digestible forms of carbohydrates because of the natural activity of the enzymes. But you're also improving the processing and nutritional qualities. And you could also be creating, or during this process, compounds like gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is it's a natural neurotransmitter, which is linked to enhanced mood or reduced anxiety levels. Again, a lot of that is still being explored, but I am aware of some products that are marketed as high GABA rice. So it's basically sprouted brown rice, which through sprouting has a higher level of GABA. So again, just when we thought we've figured grains out, or we know what the traditional means of processing are, we keep finding out that there's so much happening at the physiological and the microscopic level, which we're still yet to learn. And that's great because we are able to improve our nutritional profile in grains. And I wanted to include an example that's not bioprocessing based. So extrusion is the method that I chose because, again, it's one of those cases where extrusion has been around for I think more than a century. it's been used in a whole lot of industries. They use it in the plastic industry, they use it in the feed industry. And in the food industry, I think it was always being used fairly widely, but now with the interest in texturized proteins or plant-based meats, especially from pulses, this has taken sort of a renewed lease of life. So there's a lot of research going on with extrusion and how it's not only improving the sensory or the properties of the food matrix, but it's also improving the nutritional profile. It makes certain components more digestible. It's able to alter the protein functionality and how it behaves in an end product. So this is one technique that I would keep my eyes on. And when you go to IFT or any conferences, I bet there's a lot more interest in this avenue of processing too. And the best part is it's so adaptable, so you could really pull so many levers, try so many variables to get into different kinds of products and applications. And the versatility is what makes this technique unique. And finally, we come to application and product development. Like I said, our ultimate goal as food scientists or product development scientists should be, number one, create products that align with consumers' values. What is it that they want? Do they want a gluten-free product? Do they want a paleo diet? Whatever the demand is. We need to understand that. And then we also need to be able to create a product that can overcome certain barriers, like the sensory properties. It has to taste good. It has to feel right. The flavor should not be compromised. And also, it should be affordable. That is also a very important barrier. And finally, it has to positively impact their health. And I deliberately put this at the bottom, even though we're talking about nutrition, because if you don't check the first two boxes, you're not really going to go anywhere. So, like I said, you can have a really good product which is very nutritious, but if the first two components are not there, if they're compromised, we're not going to make a whole lot of progress. This is an example that most of you are perhaps familiar with or even consume. So oat milk is a very interesting product and an application in itself. It's fairly well researched and documented, but there are some opportunities for further development. For example, how do we retain the protein concentration or the protein profile after we've produced the milk? Because during the processing stages, some of the proteins do get taken out, or some of the beta glucan or some of the fiber is being removed. So some ways to sort of overcome this challenge is to look at high protein cultivars to begin with. So the idea is if you can start with a really high concentration in the raw material, and you have to process it in a certain way, and there is some loss of nutrients, you will still end up with a relatively higher content of protein or fiber at the end of it. That way, innovations in the field translate to better products in the bench and in the consumer's refrigerator or table. And that's why it's important to tie those three components together. Again, needless to say, it is vegan friendly, it's sustainable in comparison to dairy milk. It can be fortified with things like vitamins and minerals if necessary, bringing it very close to the actual dairy-based milk. Also, I mentioned earlier that one of the challenges with formulating using grains is the protein profile. So again, it's a bit of a seesaw because cereals and seeds like chia, for example, they are high in sulfur-containing amino acids, whereas things like lysine are limiting. And on the other hand, legumes occupy the opposite end of the spectrum. So it could be a challenge, or it could be an opportunity, because you could always sort of combine them to complement each other's protein profiles and create products where you have a more well-rounded protein profile. You're not as compromised when you use like one or the other. An example of that is like protein bars that we made, for example, within our organization, where we combined, high protein oats with chickpeas just to balance the profile. And we therefore are able to get closer to a PDCAS score of 1, which I mentioned is the highest you can get. And, it's in protein bars or breakfast bars are very unique because of late, a lot of consumers they're really into snacking a whole lot. So the idea is to provide healthier snacks. So if we can substitute a pack of potato chips or crisps with one of these bars, so you're able to snack, but at the same time on something more nutritious that has a well-balanced profile. So it's great if you want to go to the gym, or if you don't have time in the morning when you're running to your classes, just grab one of these and you're good to go. And of course, these are just examples. It's by no means an exhaustive list. So I just wanted to make that known as well. There are so many ways, again, with the diversity of grains that are available, you can go in one of an infinite number of avenues for product development. So just to sum this all up, some of the trends where grains can really shine is, taking advantage of the better for you foods. Consumers are more and more aware of the fact that food plays a big role in improving their overall health and well-being. They're starting to make these connections and not only understand that, but knowing which kinds of foods to sort of favor. Right. So again, it's all about providing as many good choices as possible to the consumer. There's a lot of interest in not just the macronutrient and micronutrient, but also functional ingredients or functional bioactive compounds like phenolic compounds, for example, antioxidants. So these are nutrients or components that go above and beyond your basic nutrition and provide some additional benefit. So consumers are becoming increasingly aware of that. There's the continuing trend of plant-based, but moving forward, you might hear it as plant-forward instead of plant-based. It's more of semantics, but there are labeling implications involved. But regardless, grains are going to be a part of that as well. Nutrition has to be holistic. And that's why when you grow these or develop these varieties, you also have to keep sustainability in mind. A good example of this is there is an organization called the Land Institute. They developed a grain called kernza. You may be familiar with kernza. It's an alternative, crop that is great. It has a lot of good environmental benefits. It sort of holds the soil better, it prevents erosion. It adds nitrogen back to the soil, but it also has a fairly high protein content. So nutrition and sustainability cannot be looked at as two separate things. Moving forward, there are lots of opportunities to take a more holistic approach to sort of developing these strains or varieties. And at the end of the day, nutrition has to be affordable. There's no point in making an excellent bar that again could save your life if it's $100, right? Or if it costs $1,000. It has to be affordable at the end of the day, and that is where again cereals shine because it can be produced at scale. It can be produced in a variety of environments, unlike several other crops. So with that, this is my final slide. I want to leave you with just these couple of points. Just to emphasize that grains, we call them the humble grain, but actually not so humble because there's so much we still need to learn about them. We can still keep digging, and there's ample scope for innovation. They will continue to play a big role in our dietary patterns and food culture. Trends come and trends go. That's the nature of the world we live in. But no matter what happens, I'm quite confident that grains and cereals, legumes, pseudo cereals, they will continue to occupy a very important part of our diet. So that has implications for nutrition and well-being as well. And as I promised, that was my last slide, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any. And thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ram, for excellent presentation. I learned a lot. Now, students and in the audience, please feel free to ask any questions you may have. You can unmute yourself or you can text in the chat box, please.
Yes, Aishwarya.
Hey, are you able to hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. It was a great session. So I had one question. When you were discussing about those high protein naked oats or hulls
Yeah.
oats, so I am a huge consumer of overnight oats for my breakfast, but
Right.
I wasn't able to get the cooking process for those kind of oats. So
Right.
is there a way to make those oats quickly so that people can consume them like normal oats or maybe rolled oats, I guess?
Absolutely. And the difference in the way we cook them basically comes down to how flatly we roll them, right? So we have different varieties or different grades of oats, uh, depending on how thin they're rolled or how thick they're rolled. So the thicker they are, they're going to be more chewy. They're going to take a longer time to cook. And that would be your traditional oats, right? And in this case, if you have a higher protein content, that would, you could expect them to be a little extra chewy. So I would say look for options that are closer to instant oats. And I think with our product, Bob's Red Mill carries, they have a product that uses so naked oats, I believe. So that might be worth checking out. But again, it comes down to how they're processed more than their actual nutritional composition.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Also, I just wanted to let you guys know in case we run out of time and you have to run, feel free to email me. I've left my email there, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I don't want anyone to feel like I didn't touch upon their questions. Any other questions at all? If not, I have one for you. So, okay, let me go ahead and ask you this. As food scientists, right? The point I made when I started, do you have you ever thought about what the difference between these, what a legume versus a lentil is? Or has that ever occurred? Has a thought occurred to you maybe when you formulate stuff or when you think about nutrition or even when you communicate in the class? So has that ever come up? Or were you all like pretty set on like, yeah, I know what this is, I know what that is? Uh, the reason I ask is a lot of this has to do with consumer perceptions too, right? Because a lot of times the messages are lost when we talk about all these different terms, different grains. And on a nutritional level, if we can't communicate exactly what this grain does, when it gets lost in the noise, I think a lot of issues stem from that. If we can't accurately communicate what we're talking about and what's the nutritional benefit. So, I don't know if you get this question or not, but I get asked a lot about gluten and what gluten is, and is it a toxin? Is it a protein? Is it a starch? So again, as a food scientist, I think it's my duty. Science communication is part of the job. So I think having an understanding of these different terminologies, different phrases, commonly used terms in the industry, I felt that's always of value. So each day I'm learning a little new, and I thought I'd share that with you guys too.
That's a great point.
And I was also very impressed when I was preparing for this presentation. I was just looking at, I believe you have a YouTube channel. The food science program has a YouTube channel. And about 4 years back, I think some of your students created like a alternative hummus that didn't use chickpeas. And this is available. I don't know if you guys have checked it out, but I strongly encourage you to do so. I had a good time because that's a big trending topic. We deal with chickpeas as well, and then I believe someone was trying to formulate a keto grain-free snack bar. So I felt that was very interesting. They've done a very good job.
Thanks, Dr. Ram. Yeah, we do have a product development activity. Any additional questions from the audience? Okay. If no, I would like to thank you, Dr. Ram, again, for giving us such a instructive seminar. We learn a lot because our department or our program has been heavily focused on food microbiology side of the story, much less on food chemistry. So this is a great instruction for both our staff, faculty, as well as our students to know more about grain science and grain chemistry. We really appreciate that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I guess one last, I'm sorry, I think there's a question from.
Yeah, great. You have comments, feel free.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm the department chair and I'm sorry I'm not on video at the moment, but I thought this was a really enlightening seminar. And so I really appreciate you taking the time. We hear about so many other things and I feel like, particularly the wheat category is really not, had its day in the sun. And I'm really thrilled to hear about some of the work that's going on to improve nutritional profiles. I'm a nutrition scientist by training. So really thrilled to hear what you guys are doing. So thank you for the talk today.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a pleasure. And the idea is with grains, especially with wheat, because we've had wheat for so long and we almost take it for granted. Likewise, with many of our raw staple ingredients, I think it's very humbling when you think about how much there is still to learn. Every time we turn a corner and we think I think we figured this out, you realize there are 10 other things that'll make you, scratch your head. And I think that's the exciting part too, as, folks in the food and nutritional space. I think it's almost our duty to sort of like communicate these benefits, to sort of find these answers and communicate it to the larger audience, which includes consumers. And I absolutely agree. Nutrition can be a very tricky subject, but with the right and balanced way of communicating it, I think there's lots to achieve. And I've had some when I did my master's, it was master's in food science and nutrition. And we had this thing about, antioxidant this, antioxidant that, but why isn't no one consuming more of it? Because if it can prevent cancer or prevent diabetes, why isn't no one eating more of it? Again, there are challenges when it comes to nutrition. You cannot look at it as single molecules or just the effect of one component on a larger system. It has to be holistic. And there's always something new to be learned from wheat or, corn or millets. It's the International Year of Millets also, by the way. So the UN has recognized the value of millets and the role it plays in our diet. So another fun fact. And if I may add another one, and this is a professional development opportunity for the faculty and the team as well, for the students as well. In October, in the third week of October, there is a conference in Schaumburg, Illinois, not too far from your campus. It's organized by the Cereals and Grains Association. Now, it's very different from IFT in the fact that it's very focused on cereals and grains. So most of the folks who go to this conference, they're very, very laser focused on cereals and grains, food chemistry, applications, product development, stuff like that. Now, I know it's short notice, but if it's of interest, please do give it a look. It might be worth your while signing up to be a member if that's what you're interested in. And I also wanted to leave this on the table. I will be attending the conference. So if anyone wants to connect on the sidelines, I'm happy to, do that as well. And like I said, any questions at any time, always happy to sort of have a chat and have a discussion.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll just point out, yes, grains I misspoke when I just said wheat, but grains in general for sure. If you could just say the name of that conference again and the dates, I'll type it in the chat for everyone.
Absolutely. So it's called Cereals and Grains 23. And let me just pull the dates real quick. So this is going to be, I believe, from the 17th to the 18th to the 20th of October. And this is happening in Schaumburg, Illinois.
Yeah, so students, this is not very far from our campus, maybe a half hour. So really super opportunity to, if I spelled that right, to, look into. And then, of course, you can reach out to Dr. Ram. So, yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ram, and thank you everyone for attending the seminar today. Make sure you write up your written summary and upload to the Google Drive as I explained in emails. Okay. Okay, have a nice day, everyone.
Take care.
All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.